A very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants. It's a very big occasion that we have been able to get such a good response to this event. This event is a webinar on climate change impact and adaptation, spotlight on India, is being taken under the aegis of a research project, which is GCRF, funded by UK Research and Innovation and being led by the University of Newcastle. This project is a very huge project, which is on the water security and sustainable development, and being run in 5 different countries. We have hubs in different countries, and the main hub is in Newcastle in UK. I will now request Richard Dawson, who's the principal investigator and very able leader of this particular project. I'm sure that this project is going to make an ample difference, not only for the specific countries, but globally. I'll request him to just give an overview of the project and welcome this gathering, and also some about the webinar series which we have had just started under the GCRF project. Over to Professor Richard Dawson.
Thank you very much, Professor Gosain. So welcome everybody to this important seminar on climate change impact and adaptation, a spotlight on India. As you just heard, this is being organised as part of a series on climate change impacts under the Water Security and Sustainable Development Hub that is funded by UK Research and Innovation. Our project as a whole is looking at a very wide range of water security issues. We're trying to apply and develop systems approaches that address multiple risks to water, whether those are flooding, droughts, pollution, looking through the lens of how people value and understand water and how they use it. But a really important cross-cutting driver and pressure to all of these is around climate change. And with the COP, the UN's negotiating vehicle, the Conference of the Parties taking place later this year, it seems incredibly timely to bring together thinking about how we can better understand the impacts of climate change and adapt to those impacts in the context of water security, because these risks are really significant globally, and they're really significant in India, as I'm sure we'll be hearing over the coming hour or so. As I mentioned, this is part of a wider series. We've had a launch seminar from Professor Jim Hall earlier this year, and there'll be more in this series later on. So if you are interested, please do let us know, and we'll make sure you receive those communications to join as well. We'll be focusing on different parts of the world where the Water Hub is working. I'd also like to extend my thanks, though, to Professor Gosain, Professor Dhanya, and all their colleagues at IIT Delhi for putting this on today and hosting what looks to be a really exciting presentation, bringing together colleagues from across India as well. So thank you so much, very much for joining us, and to all the speakers in advance. I'll hand over back to the program now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Richard Dawson. We'll now start with the session. This webinar is divided over 2 sessions. The first session is having presentations from the domain experts, and we have the honor to have people who are the leaders in their respective areas, and they are the ones who have pioneered the climate change science issues, as well as the communication made by India to the UNFCCC. This session is going to be chaired by Professor Dhanya, and she'll be also explaining that all those people who want to put questions, You can put your question in the chat box, and there is a separate session which is kept at the end of the presentations, where you'll have the answers given by the respective speakers to your questions. Over to Dhanya.
Thank you, Professor Gosain. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to this session 1 of this webinar. We have 4 spotlight presentations of 12 minutes each from 4 eminent speakers. Our experienced speakers represent 4 diverse fields: atmospheric sciences, water resources, hydrology, agriculture, and even ecology. But all of them are connected with the common link, that is climate change. So without any further delay, I invite our first speaker, Professor Somnath Baidya Roy, to deliver his speech. So Professor Somnath Baidya Roy is a faculty of the Center for Atmospheric Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. He had a long experience of almost 18 years of working in different places in the USA before joining IIT Delhi in 2013. He received his PhD from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and after which he worked as a postdoc in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Princeton University, a research associate in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Duke University, and worked as an assistant professor in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Illinois. His primary areas of interest are modeling mesoscale land-atmosphere interactions and renewable energy metrology. He serves as a chief editor of Earth Systems Dynamics, a journal published by European Geosciences Union. Now I welcome Professor Baidya Roy to deliver his speech on carbon fluxes from terrestrial ecosystems of India. Over to you, Somnath.
Thank you, Dhanya. Thanks for the nice introduction. So today I'm going to talk about carbon fluxes over terrestrial ecosystems of India, recognizing that this is kind of like, our audience base is very broad. So I'll try to keep it short and sweet. And also I'll explain some of the terminology that we use in like modeling carbon. So first, as we know that the Earth system, it has many components. So the carbon cycle is something that like directly couples the atmosphere and the biosphere, and also of course like, with the lithosphere and hydrosphere. And so this coupling is very important for us, because like when we try to understand what is climate and what is climate change, we need to not just look at like, one aspect of the Earth system, but all the components of the Earth system that are interacting with each other. So now here is a very simple cartoon showing the different like reservoirs and the fluxes quantitatively in the carbon cycle. Now, I mean, it's of course very complex and the numbers are very small. I don't expect you to read all of them. I'm just going to point out some important things. So like here in red, what we have is the anthropogenic contribution, and the black numbers are the natural kind of like, components, if you may, like, or pre-industrial basically. So we can take that as natural. Now, so what we see here, that the anthropogenic land sink of carbon, that is the amount of carbon that is absorbed from the atmosphere by the terrestrial ecosystem, it's 2.6 petagrams of carbon per year. So this number seems small, like when we look at the total atmospheric reservoir, which is 829 petagrams. But that's not the right comparison. I think we should really compare it with the trend or other fluxes. For example, the trend of the atmospheric increase of carbon is 4 petagrams per year. So 2.6 and 4, they are quite comparable. And also, if we look at the amount of carbon emitted due to anthropogenic land use land cover change, that's 1.1 petagrams per year. So we can see that the land surface plays a very important role in the dynamics of the carbon cycle. And this is important because, of course, we all know that atmospheric carbon is one of the major drivers behind climate change. Now, how does like land surface, I mean, what are the processes involved? How does land surface affect carbon cycle? So there are mainly two things that we need to look at. The first is photosynthesis. This is the process by which the vegetation, it absorbs atmospheric carbon and stores this in form of carbohydrate in roots, stems, and leaves. And that is called the gross primary production. That's the photosynthetically assimilated carbon. Now, plants also emit carbon when they respire. During respiration, oxygen is taken in and carbon dioxide is emitted. So if we subtract the respiration by the plants, which is called autotrophic respiration, that gives us the net primary production. Also, another type of respiration that occurs from the soil. Remember that the soil holds about 3 times as much carbon as compared to the atmosphere. Of course, there is more in the permafrost. So when this carbon is broken down by the microbes, there is respiratory losses. That's heterotrophic respiration. And when we take that out, then what we end up with is the net ecosystem production, NEP. And the opposite of that is called the NEE, which is just minus NEP. And also we can account for disturbances like land use, land cover change, and fire. And when we account for that, then we have the net biome production. So NEP, NEE, and NBP, these are the things that we should be looking at, because they account for not only the carbon that is assimilated, but also the carbon that is lost. So that's why it's a net. Now, when we look at observations of these fluxes over India, the thing is that our observations are very, very limited. Almost there are like a number of flux towers from the ISRO GBP program and the Ministry of Earth Sciences MedFlux program, but these fluxes are measured only over the tropical forests. What the results show that from these flux towers, that the numbers of the associated with NEE, they are all negative, which tells us that the forest ecosystems are carbon sinks. But forests are only one part of the land cover in India. There are a wide range of ecosystems present. The observations that we have from there are very limited. There are some observations over croplands, but they are not readily available over public domain. So we then try to look at satellites. However, the satellite data is kind of all over the place. Like if you look at this study by Nayak et al., here they found that 2 different instruments, AVHRR and MODIS, there is a difference of 2.5 times, a factor of 2.5 between the 2 different estimates. So this is our challenge. We have limited and very focused observations, ground observations, good quality observations. But how do we kind of extrapolate or scale that up to look at the entire country as a whole? So one of the options there is like using models. Now, the challenge here is again, that there are here, we did a study, looked at like 13 different models from the trendy data set. We see that the net biome productivity, it's positive, which means that the ecosystem, terrestrial ecosystems of India are carbon sinks. However, you look at the spread is larger than the mean, because that means that in some models, they're actually showing a net negative NBP. That is, they are saying that the Indian ecosystem is a source. Those are outliers, of course. In general, like most models tend to show us that like we are still a net carbon sink, but the spread is very, very high. Now, there are many drivers of terrestrial carbon fluxes. If we want to understand that what drives these kinds of signs, we need to look at, there are 4 main processes that I have put together in this schematic. The first is increase in atmospheric CO2. So CO2 is, as we know, plant food. If there is more carbon in the atmosphere, there will be more photosynthesis. And that means there will be more carbon assimilation by the terrestrial ecosystems, as shown by this green downward pointing arrow. Climate change has mixed effect on the carbon sink. When we talk about warming creates respiratory losses. It also reduces productivity. So it has a negative impact on the carbon sink. But on the other hand, warming also increases the growing season, especially for winter crops like spring wheat and other crops that are grown all over the country now. So a positive impact from the change in the growing season. Rainfall patterns, it's very hard to tell because there is no clear signal of rainfall in India. These are very regionally oriented. So regions where we may end up with or have more rainfall, there will be a reduction in water stress, leading to increased productivity and perhaps increased carbon sequestration. Nitrogen deposition enhances the nutrient supply and has a positive effect on the carbon sink. Land use land cover change, again, as we know that it depends on whether it's deforestation or afforestation. Depending on that, the sign of effect on the carbon sink could be positive or negative. Now, so these are the processes. How do we quantify them? How do we know that which one is more important, which one is less important? So for that purpose, we use process-based land models. These are actually like, very complex computer softwares with lakhs of hundreds of thousands of lines of code that simulate the different processes that are involved in land atmosphere interactions. And these processes include like simple biogeophysical processes like sensible and latent heat fluxes, hydrological processes that measure like how much water is going in, how much runoff is there. Of course, biogeochemistry, the carbon and the nitrogen cycle, that's very important. And many of them also include like long-term ecosystem dynamics as well. So what we did is like we did some experiments with a process-based land model called ISAM. And here, as we have reported earlier, that we found a positive NBP, which means that the biosphere, the terrestrial ecosystems of India are carbon sinks. And the sink is mostly maintained by, like, if you look at the effect of CO2, the sink is mostly maintained by carbon fertilization. The effect of land use land cover change, of course, is negative. And so is the effect of climate change, because as I said, that the precipitation signal over India is not very strong. And most of these climate effects are due to respiratory losses resulting from the warming. So now I showed you one model, but I also want to point something out, that the models themselves, like, I mean, there is a lot of spread. For example, like if you look at this study where they looked at 12 different models, and you can, and also not only how they simulate the carbon sink, but also what are the effects of these factors on the carbon sink. You will see that there is a wide spread. For example, like, in the SIB-CASA model, it shows that most of the carbon sink is maintained by CO2 fertilization. But here, like, in some other models, we can see that land use land cover change also has an equally strong impact. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that, like, I will point out this particular graph here where we see the tropics. Here we can see that when we actually incorporate both carbon and nitrogen cycle, then the tropical carbon sink is very close to zero. And that is perhaps because the tropical forests are fairly mature, and mature forests do not assimilate as much carbon. Whatever they assimilate goes out as respiration. So I'll try to finish quickly. Basically, what I wanted to say that, like, I showed you results from one model, but there is a lot of spread. And that is why we perhaps need to look at multiple models. We also looked at, like, we built a spring wheat model in ISAM to look at carbon fluxes in spring wheat agroecosystems. I'm going to just skip these slides and come to the most important slide here, where if we look at the net NEP in spring wheat agroecosystems, we will see again that CO2 is a very important factor. It's almost as important as irrigation. Temperature, respiratory losses due to warming, of course, has a very strong negative impact. But the nitrogen fertilizer has the strongest impact, and this is, of course, increasing with time. So now I'll quickly summarize, like, what I wanted to have discussed so far, that we have very limited observations from ground stations. The estimates that we have from satellites and models are, I mean, they are robust in some senses because we have a lot of them, but on the other hand, the spread between them is very large. The terrestrial, if we look at the mean, ensemble mean, then we will find that the terrestrial ecosystems of India are a net carbon sink, and this is maintained mostly by carbon fertilization. But however, if we pay attention to land use land cover change like reforestation and afforestation and improve management of degraded lands, then perhaps we can increase the sink. And let us remember that in the Paris NDC, the maintaining this and enhancing this carbon sink was one of our main contributions. And so this is very important in that context. Of course, so moving forward, we need more observations, and definitely given the spread in the models, we need an ensemble modeling approach for robust flux estimates. So with that, I'm going to stop and I hope to take your questions later in the session. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Roy. So now let me invite our second speaker, Professor Pramod Aggarwal. Professor Aggarwal is Asia Program Leader of the CGIAR Research Program on Climate Change, Agricultural and Food Security in New Delhi. He was the coordinating lead author for the chapter Food, Fiber and Forest Products of the fourth assessment report of the IPCC and also a review editor for AR5. He is a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences India and National Academy of Agricultural Sciences India. Professor Aggarwal has double PhD from University of Indore and from Wageningen University, Netherlands. His research contributions include developing the concept of climate smart villages, crop growth models, impact assessment of climatic variability and climate change on crops, novel crop insurance products, and crop yield monitoring systems. So he will be delivering a speech on managing increasing climate risk in agriculture, opportunities and constraints. Over to you, Professor Aggarwal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a great opportunity for me to present our viewpoints to this very distinguished audience here. I shall be speaking, as mentioned already, about managing increasing climatic risk in agriculture. So this is some very simple background. As we all understand, climatic risks are increasing, and especially risks related to precipitation. As you see here, it's a global scenario. Over time, many of the disasters, especially related to floods and extreme weather, have increased. What is important for us to also appreciate that many of these changes happen in developing countries like South Asia and Africa. You see the density in this particular right-hand side. It's all around Africa and South Asia. And what is also important for us to appreciate that all of these vulnerable areas are smallholder farms. You see the density of smallholders, which is red color in this particular graph, is all around South Asia, Africa, and so on and so forth. So it's basically the smallholders who are more vulnerable, largely because of this climatic risk. So there is something needs to be done about this in particular, and that's what is the focus of our research here. These are historical graphs which we have been seeing for ages, and that's what made the basis of IPCC and lots of other reports. We have been seeing them for the last 20, 25 years, that with climate change, crop production is likely to decrease and decrease significantly. And these are some of the very popular papers by Rosenweig and Fischer, where you see South Asia and Africa all are very vulnerable. India in particular, if you look at from 2020 to 2050 goes in dark red zone, yield change are projected to be as high as 30 to 40%. Now this is a very typical modeling approach that has often resulted into creating some sort of scare that yes, everything is going to be really in difficult position. But is that really correct? Now, this slide shows is somewhat different approach. What we are trying to see here is more crop-specific responses, impacts of climate change for different period. This is only for 2050, what we are showing here, but also in relation to food demand and food supply. Well, you can have impact somewhere, but if there's not enough demand, it doesn't really matter. Whereas if there's a lot of demand and there's a supply gap, and if there's a climate change, that's going to be a really difficult position for such countries. So this graph actually shows that. The red color shows where is high food production gap. That means there's a large gap between demand and supply today. And they're also likely to see high impact of climate change. And by crop. So what you see here, for example, if you just talk about Indian situation today, we are in difficult position from the perspective of wheat and maize, but not so much for rice. As per our current understanding, we are quite okay with rice, but we have to be very much worried about wheat and maize because we have food production gap as well as large impacts of climate change. And if you see large parts of Africa, they are, let's say, relatively low impacts of climate change, but they have very high food production gap already. So they are also very vulnerable simply because of food security issues today, complex in the context of rice and in the context of wheat. But maize, which is more popular crop in Africa, you see again a lot of vulnerability even in Africa as well. So I think this type of analysis, where you try to understand demand, supply, and impact and readiness of the countries, is quite useful. But there are a large number of adaptation options already available. It's not that we don't know anything. There's a number of options available because climate is something that developing countries in particular have always been exposed to. So over time, a number of adaptation options are available, such as stress-tolerant varieties, precision agronomy, resource conservation technologies, crop insurance, weather-linked advisories, early warning system, pest and disease monitoring and control. Well, these are some of the selected ones. There could be many more. In different countries, there are different stages. Even large countries like India, we have lots of some of these things, but there's still a number of constraints. I would just like to illustrate details about some of these in my next few slides. So we have, as I said, number of varieties, number of technologies, agronomic technologies, but it's a challenge to cover this large country by all of these. Simply because when we talk about from small pilots that are often done, it becomes complex when we are trying to scale up. Because scaling up is not simply doing an experiment in field like many of us do, or experiment in our experimental plots. But for scaling up, you need consideration of not only climatic factors, but soil factors, technological factors, socioeconomic, financial, policy, institutional factors, which is often not done. And actually, that's the reason lots of our innovations in technology, we are unable to scale because we don't consider all of that. So what we are trying to do is a different approach where we are considering all of these together. Climate information, what is shown, for example, on the right-hand side, a number of ways. You just don't think only about practices and technologies, but you also think about climate information services, crop insurance, link them with national and subnational plans and policies, factor in local farmers' knowledge, also consider what is the development finance and climate finance available, and what sort of institutions are available. If you consider all of them together, which becomes somewhat complex, then there are good chances of scaling. And that's why we have an approach, a climate smart village approach, which is a participatory approach, which is multi-stakeholder approach, in which what we do is test technological and institutional options together with different stakeholders working together for dealing with climatic risk in agriculture. The difference about this approach is it provides a holistic vision. As I mentioned, it's just not only biophysical, but it takes into consideration all social and economic aspects as well. And the goal is to take adaptation, climate smart agriculture to scale. It links global and local knowledge together, and it's a platform for multi-stakeholder collaboration. And the key distinguishing part is it not only helps us in enhancing adaptation, but also avoiding maladaptation. We don't want to take an action today for which we have to regret later 20 years from now. And then we try to scale it up horizontally by using a very popular extension model of hub and spoke model, and vertical scaling, linking with climate finance, largely in case of India, converging with government schemes. So this is the model that we have tried at a number of places, and we have been fairly successful in scaling up adaptation. In fact, since we work for an international organization, you also see this climate smart village approach being scaled up in a number of countries all over the world. Today, I think roughly 30 countries are practicing this at different levels and different scales. But as you can see here, a lot of success stories, especially in case of South Asia, we see a number of governments trying to adopt this particular program. My second illustration would be about crop insurance. It's a very important risk management strategy, especially in view of increasing climatic variability and also our limited capacity to forecast weather well. A lot of meteorologists may not really agree with me, but overall what we see, often we have difficulty in forecasting weather very well. And that's why crop insurance comes in very handy. But if you look at crop insurance scenario globally, it's still very unevenly popular. It's quite common in India these days. We have roughly $3 billion investment being made today. But if you see here in terms of China, Korea, Europe, Canada, US, Latin America, these are some of the countries where crop insurance is rather common. Although, of course, in theory, roughly 104 countries today have crop insurance. This slide shows further, if you look at Asia, the most important country happens to be India, which has large coverage. Roughly 50 million farmers today are covered by insurance in India, followed by some coverage in Indonesia and Vietnam. Sub-Saharan Africa, rather minuscule coverage, but again, some success in Kenya, Nigeria, and Zambia. Latin America, again, not really very popular. So you see there's still a large gap, although we have 50 million farmers covered, but still remains a large gap. We have roughly 130 million farmers here. So this is just to illustrate the Indian scenario today. So we have a scheme called in Hindi, Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, a crop insurance scheme, national scheme, which provides high level of subsidy, almost 80% subsidy to every farmer who wants to get insured for his crops. I will not have time to get into details of this very much, but today, as I said, the number of farmers insured are roughly 50 million, and we cover almost 50 million hectares. A lot of farmers benefit, but you see the amount of investment which is being made. The sum insured is almost 30,000 million US dollars annually. It's a huge sum that is being insured, and premium that is being paid every year is roughly 3,000 million US dollars. Roughly 3 billion US dollars is being paid, and 80% of that comes from state government and central government. And claim ratio is 86%. What it means, the industry is fairly viable with this type of claim ratio. What we have is a public-private partnership to scale up this. This is a very important scheme in terms of crop insurance. But what is very interesting for us to note, rather distressing for us to note, despite such a big investment, nobody seems to be happy. Governments are unhappy, industries are unhappy, and farmers, of course, are still very unhappy, simply because they are not able to get claims as and when needed. There's a huge delay in terms of claims, for a variety of reasons. Again, as I said, we will not have time to get into details of each factor at this stage. But what is very important is the real-time loss assessment. That is something of a challenge. So we are developing a number of tools. We are using multiple technologies and big data analytics to be able to support this work. Finally, some example about ICTs. I think lots of us practice this. Again, India, simply by sheer size, there's a large number of people, but there's a high dropout rate again here. It's again largely supply driven. We are not getting enough feedback. So private sector interest is increasing. So that's why there is a lot of hope about this. This is a very typical system which has been developed by our sister agency, ICRISAT. It's a sowing app, which very intelligently tells farmers when to plant and when not to plant. And now they're partnered with Microsoft and India Meteorology Department. They're trying to reach with 50 million farmers through their app. So I think this is the type of research that needs to be further done to make it available to all farmers. Finally, we are using lots of these elements for early warning system about food security monitoring. Again, a lot of use of models, satellite, crowdsourced data, weather forecasts linked to crop growth models here. We have a lot of success in this in Nepal and also in some other countries. Just to summarize, in conclusion, there are lots of opportunities, but there are multiple constraints. What is really needed is more integrated and a comprehensive approach rather than piecemeal solutions that we often come up with. We need definitely participatory approaches because without involvement of all stakeholders, the solutions are often not very practical. And for that, we need partnerships, not only just partnership between researchers, but also with development agencies, policy advisors, and also public and private sector. Knowledge generation is something that researchers keep doing, and I think that certainly needs to be strengthened, but we need much more targeting of technology, not the technology per se, but where exactly it is going to work, in what condition. I think that also needs to be very clear. What is very much missing is in general business model. Any technology, unless we accompany this with business model, that how do we scale up? Who will scale up? What role private sector has, how much it is going to cost, etc. Unless we determine that, the scaling up becomes a difficult issue. Of course, then we also need adaptation enablers in terms of linking with national policies, government schemes, and donor agendas in many countries. South-South learning can be very useful for many of us, especially in programs like what we're discussing today, multi-country programs. We can all learn from each other. My final slide, while we as researchers always talk about lots of technological options, other options, but I think there are many options which limit our adaptation capacity today, which is common not only in India, but also in most developing countries. Overall poverty, literacy, governance, issues that we see day in and out, they limit utilization of knowledge today and will continue to do so in future as well, unless those are also simultaneously addressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Aggarwal, for the very insightful lecture and touching upon the important topic of participatory approach. But we will be moving ahead to the third speaker, who is Professor Vimal Mishra from IIT Gandhinagar. Professor Vimal Mishra is presently a faculty of the Civil Engineering and Earth Sciences at Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar. Prior to joining IIT Gandhinagar, he completed his PhD from Purdue University and postdoctoral fellowship from University of Washington, Seattle. Professor Mishra's research focuses on large-scale hydrological modeling, remote sensing, and climate change impacts on water resources. In addition, Professor Mishra has been working on the understanding of hydrological extremes, both floods and droughts, during the observed and projected future climate. Professor Mishra's research work has been published in the leading journals such as PNAS, Nature in Geoscience, Geophysical Research Letters, and Water Resources Research. He is currently serving as an editor of Earth's Future and an associate editor of Journal of Hydrology. Over to you, Professor Mishra.
All right, Dhanya, thank you very much for invitation. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about water resources under changing climate. And you know, we have been doing a lot of work on this topic, but today I'm not going to discuss about our work, but recently released IPCC WG1 chapter 8, that is water cycle. So I'll provide a summary and then I'll quickly leave some questions that are related to climate change adaptation, you know, in Indian context. So I mean, physical basis for water cycle change, we all know that there is a very high confidence that there is a change in Earth's energy budget and anthropogenic radiative forcing. So that is increasing the capacity of atmosphere to hold more moisture. And that is basically increasing the atmospheric evaporative demands and leading to severity of droughts. So there is a very high confidence on all these changes that are directly related to water cycle. Causes of observed change means whatever we have observed, and these are basically summary from chapter 8 of WG1 IPCC AR6. And that is basically the detectable change over the 20th century. There is a high confidence that is driven by anthropogenic factors. Also, which is anthropogenic aerosols also have contributed to a detectable change. And when we think about Indian hydrology, I mean, the role of aerosol becomes even more important. And the other factor that is important is land use change and water extraction for irrigation. And again, that's very relevant for Indian context. So all these 3 points basically direct us towards what observed changes are and what have been the causes behind those. And then how the water cycle is going to change in the future. So if we continue to emit greenhouse gas emissions, there is going to be substantial changes in the water cycle, especially in terms of extremes related to droughts and floods. There is a lot more uncertainty on the monsoon precipitation projections. So there is a medium confidence, and natural climate variability is going to play a major role in terms of uncertainty on water cycle projections. So we have to make decisions under this uncertainty when it comes about adaptation. Now, I mean, this is extremely important figure, which is again from IPCC AR6, and that tells us that how different durations precipitation extremes are basically likely to change in the future, and basically changed over the years in terms of observation. So if we have short duration extremes, they are more sensitive to warming, as much as could be 15 to 20% increase per degree rise in global mean temperature. Daily scale precipitation extremes are slightly less, sensitive to the warming. So these changes basically directly linked with the how hydrologic extremes or floods are going to translate in response to these changes. So, I mean, there have been observed changes that you can see on the top panel, especially from 1985 to 2015. And if you focus in the South Asian region, there are both increases and declines in the rainfall, especially over the Indo-Gangetic plain. There is a decline, increase in the Western India. And then climate models have been sort of run to look at what factors, especially greenhouse gases and anthropogenic aerosol emissions, how do they affect these changes, observed changes in precipitation? So we find that if we increase the amount of aerosols, there is going to be decline in rainfall. On the other hand, increase in greenhouse gases emissions will translate to increase or translate to increase in rainfall or precipitation. Evapotranspiration is another good variable. Once again, the observed changes, we see that there has been increase in ET, especially in the areas where rainfall has increased. On the other hand, decline in evapotranspiration in the area where precipitation has declined. And the same way, we see greenhouse gases emissions are linked with the increases. On the other hand, aerosols are linked with the declines. So the interplay between these two factors is going to be very, very important as far as future projections are concerned. These are the changes in precipitation over the major monsoon regions. So I would like you to focus in South Asian domain here in pink color. And that tells us again that greenhouse gases emissions basically contribute to increasing trend in rainfall, and aerosols is declining trend, and observed trends are somewhere here, and overall changes are represented by this box plot of black. So how these two factors will play, I mean, that will decide that what is going to be the monsoon variability or what kind of changes we are going to see in the future. But overall, there is a slightly declining trend if you look at the past 1951 to 2014 period. Right, and these changes, basically the human impacts as well as the changes in the climate, both affects the water availability. So this is changes in terrestrial water storage estimated based on the GRACE satellite. And again, you see that part of India shows decline in the water storage, and part of India is showing the increase. And these are again driven by both human as well as natural factors like increase in precipitation, decline in precipitation, and groundwater pumping for irrigation. Now, this is about the future, like how hydrology or water cycle will change in response to future warming. So on x-axis, you see the global warming level. On y-axis, you see the changes averaged over land across different CMIP6 models. So what you here plotted is mean and variability, changes in mean and variability in response to different global warming levels. But what is important here to understand, to look at the uncertainty. So there is a lot more uncertainty, but one thing is clear, that precipitation as well as runoff, mean as well as variability, is going to increase as we increase the global warming level with respect to pre-industrial climate, 80, 50, 1900. So these are the projections, basically ET for different SSP scenarios for 2 seasons, December, January, February, June, July, August. So let's focus on the monsoon. And so how ET is going to change. So most of the models basically suggest that ET is going to increase, because there are projections of increased rainfall during the monsoon season. But there is a lot of disagreement among the models that you can see here by the hatching. So there is not very high agreement. So a lot of uncertainty in these projections is there, which we have to consider when it comes about adaptation at regional scales. Similarly, these are the changes in runoff. Here again, we see like SSP 8.5, there is a significant increase projected over South Asia or India, but SSP 2.6, 4.5, again, not very high agreement among the CMIP6 model in terms of how runoff is going to change or how water availability will change over the Indian or Indian subcontinent. What will happen to soil moisture? Basically, these are the vapor pressure deficit. That is the driving factor of evapotranspiration. So SSP 5, 8.5, we see there is an increase in soil moisture. Again, low agreement over the South Asian region in all 3 SSP scenarios. So there is going to remain uncertainty whether we are going to witness more agricultural drought because of enhanced radiative forcing or warming, or less droughts in the future. So that we have to see, because even if we receive more and more increase in rainfall during the monsoon season, the dry season warming could enhance the vapor pressure deficit or atmospheric water demands, and that could lead to decline in soil moisture and leading to agricultural droughts. Now, when it comes about what happens to basin scale runoff, so here the major global river basins are plotted. In the Indian subcontinent, only one river basin is, that is Indus. And what you can see on x-axis is the warming. So 3 degree, 4 degree, 2 degree warming from the pre-industrial level. And amazingly, you can see that how much uncertainty is there in terms of projections, especially as you increase the warming level. So it goes from minus 30 to somewhere 100% increase. So the decision making with this kind of uncertainty when it comes adaptation in the water sector becomes increasingly difficult, right? So what basically are the important questions related to adaptation? And these are based on, the review of water cycle chapter. So how will be the interplay between climate and human interventions, aerosol, irrigation, and how that will affect the changes and variability in the summer monsoon in the future? That remains a sort of important question. How rainfall characteristics will change in terms of intensity and duration, because that has direct relationship with the groundwater recharge, groundwater storage in reservoirs, reservoir operations, and so on and so forth. How water use in agriculture will change, especially the water demands for irrigation during the dry season, and how that will affect the overall water sustainability. That is again a question that we need to sort of understand in a better manner. Then again, how the summer season variability in stream flow will change in response to changing in cryosphere, especially Himalayan river basin, because there will be changes in glaciers and snow melt. How will the hydrologic extremes, drought and floods will change, and how that will affect the overall water availability and demands in the Indian subcontinent. Compound extremes, is a growing area, like how 2 types of extremes will occur together, like droughts and heat waves during the dry season or summer, and that will affect the water availability. But what is the most important here is that how we can develop more reliable and regional scale projections, given that Indian landmass is highly influenced by aerosols, different human interventions like irrigation, intensive agriculture, groundwater pumping. And so these projections from GCMs at coarser scale sometimes may not provide us or may not represent the complexity that we have over India or in the South Asian domain. The other is how will the human intervention, agriculture, irrigation, reservoir operation, groundwater abstraction will affect hydrology under climate change. So, I mean, this is the quick summary of my talk, and I'm done. If you have any questions, I would be happy to sort of answer. If you want to look at the papers related to water cycle changes, you can always visit our website, that is Water and Climate Lab at IIT Gandhinagar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vimal, for the very informative speech. Essentially, you have touched upon the climate change impact on and all the processes of hydrological cycle. And also, thanks for posing all these questions for the future research. So now I invite Professor Ravindranath to deliver his talk. Professor Ravindranath is a faculty of the Center for Sustainable Technologies, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. He has focused his research, advocacy, and publications on various dimensions of climate change, mitigation assessment, greenhouse gas emissions, inventory in land use sectors, impact of climate change and vulnerability assessment in forest and agroecosystems, adaptation and climate resilience, forest ecology, etc. He has also worked on bioenergy, biofuels, and biomass production, environmental ecosystem services, and also citizen science. He is an author of several IPCC reports, including the latest IPCC report AR5, and has contributed on mitigation in forest sector. He is also an author for IPBES, Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. He has worked for UNFCCC, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, UNDP, etc. on climate change related research, project design, and monitoring aspects. He also have played a pioneering and key role in creating awareness on climate change in many developing countries and assisted them in preparing their first greenhouse gas emissions inventories and mitigation strategies to address climate change starting from the early 1990s. He also has published around 8 books, out of which 4 are purely focused on climate change. He was also on the editorial board of several top international journals like ERL, Environmental Research Letters, Biomass and Bioenergy, MITI journals, etc. Now I invite Professor Ravindranath to deliver his talk on adaptation strategies, forest and agroecosystems. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dhanya. I'm going to talk about briefly about the impact of climate change on forest ecosystems and adaptation to climate change in the forest ecosystems. Well, climate change is going to impact all the natural ecosystems, forests, wetlands, mangroves, grasslands, freshwater ecosystems, marine, and so on. The impacts are wide-ranging. There will be shifts in biomes, shifts from forest to grasslands, and complete loss of ecosystems such as wetlands, loss of biodiversity, loss of millions of known species, decrease or increase in biomass in different ecosystems, forest fire, you're all aware of that, pest diseases, and of course it's linked to water security as well, apart from carbon cycle. And if IPCC has provided a lot of evidence to show climate change is already impacting all the natural ecosystems, forests, wetlands, grasslands, and marine ecosystems, and so on. Again, especially the recent events of the last few years, such as heat waves, drought, floods, cyclones, and wildfires, have impacted all the ecosystems. Of course, when they impact natural ecosystems, human societies will obviously be impacted. And globally, the increase in temperature, aridity, drought have all contributed to forest fires. We have seen forest fires in Canada, in Siberia, in the United States, Australia. In 2019, 9 million hectares of forests were burnt in Australia, and millions of animal, birds, and whatever etc. species were completely lost. Imagine the scale of impact. So we all know that degradation and fragmentation of forests, grasslands, etc., they will make them more vulnerable to climate change. And climate change is driving many changes leading to death of mortality of trees, and that will have impact on many other aspects of nature and society. Again, climate change is impacting. There's a lot of evidence to show how it's impacting species distribution, phenology, many ecosystem functions, and in fact many of the species extinction have been linked to climate change around the world. And according to a lot of observation, the effects of climate change are accelerating on land-based or terrestrial ecosystems. See, the abundance of native species is also changing many ecosystems. A lot of observed shifts in species distribution, change in many ecosystem functions have already been observed. And coming to the future, IPCC 1.5 degree report showed that even we all know the Earth has already warmed by 1.1 to 1.2 degrees. Even at 1.5 degree or 2 degrees, many ecosystems will be adversely impacted, as we have seen recently with respect to forest fires. And whether it's cropland or it's flooding or terrestrial ecosystems or mangroves, all ecosystems will be impacted even at 1.5 degree warming or 2 degree warming. And if you look at the projected impacts of climate change, of course, climate change will become a very important driver of many changes in the ecosystems, forests, wetlands, mangroves, etc. The adverse impacts will be severe even at 1.5 degree and 2 degree, and we are almost there at 1.5 degree. And since many studies have shown that according to recent assessment by global biodiversity assessment IPBES, 1 million known species will be extinct before the end of the century, even much earlier. 1 million, which is a large number. And we all know with increased temperature, drought and aridity, forest fires and grassland fires are increasing. More than 2/3 of the land surface is covered by forest and grasslands, and there are human societies all over, spread all over these grasslands and forest lands. And almost, according to news study, almost 1/3 to 2/3 of the land area will be subjected to fires in grasslands and forests, and almost close to 1 billion people will be impacted by forest fires around the world. And if you look little more, and again forests and water security are very closely linked. Any adverse impact of climate change in forests will impact water security. We all know how forests are important for water supply, for drinking and agriculture and so on. Globally, 4 billion people depend on forested watersheds, and their water availability depends on the quality of the watersheds. Again, projected increase in wildfires in grasslands and forests will lead to loss of vegetation cover. That will lead to long-term reduction in the water flows and increased soil erosion, again increased sedimentation. And again, the fire conditions, even under current fire conditions, fire vulnerability, nearly half the global land is vulnerable to risk. And in future, as I said, even almost up to 1/3 of the land surface could be vulnerable to forest fire linked destruction. And a combination of climate change and land use change, that will lead to loss of or degradation of forest cover and grassland cover, will reduce water flows. And coming to Indian study, we did some modeling for how climate change will impact forests. Fortunately, if you look at all the green patch, bulk of the forest patches in central India and Western Ghats are okay. They may not be impacted according to this model. But otherwise, in the Himalayas region and in the northeast, the red dots, the red squares show that there will be change in vegetation. That means the current biodiversity will not survive the future climate. There's almost 20 to 25% of the forested area will undergo change. That means all the biodiversity in those lands will be lost. And when you do some vulnerability assessment, which is independent of climate, we found that almost 40% of the forested grids are under high and very high vulnerability classes. And fortunately, a lot of the forests in the Western Ghats and Himalayas are less vulnerable. And coming to adaptation, and IPCC, working group 2, in the SPM, the first paragraph, it said the first step towards adaptation to climate change is reducing vulnerability and exposure to present climate variability. In this sense, we need to worry about current vulnerabilities and how to adapt to that. Again, the impact of climate change on forests and grasslands and on biodiversity is long-term and irreversible. And normal, management activities are not adequate to address this. That means adaptation is required now, and because especially in the forest sector, unlike, in the case of drought or in the case of forest fire, you can see the impact on ecosystems immediately. But in the case of biodiversity, it's long term. There's a lag. It can take decades before you know the impact of climate change on biodiversity. So that's the reason why there is a need for adaptation now around the world in natural ecosystems, forests and grasslands, which are very critical for biodiversity, water supply, and food security, and so on. Coming to adaptation strategies, there are a whole range of practice available. There are silvicultural practices, and there are conservation measures and policies, and many other factors. I'll only just highlight a few. And of course, if you look at what can we do, silviculture, afforestation, reforestation, we need to undertake what's called anticipatory planting. From lower elevation, you plant them at higher elevation. From lower latitude, take the species and plant them at higher latitude, because science has shown species move along the latitude and altitude. Again, we need to promote native species and mixed species forestry rather than monocultures of eucalyptus, teak, and acacia, and so on. We need to promote naturalization, because biodiversity-rich forests are less vulnerable to climate change than monoculture forests. And we need to protect the existing ecosystems, forests, grasslands, wetlands, etc. That's the best resilience to climate change impacts. Of course, we need to avoid disturbance to soil and its biodiversity. Coming to some of the forest conservation measures, we need to prioritize protecting the existing forests, grasslands, wetlands, which we all know are getting degraded. And there is a need to link, because we know, as we said, plants and animals move with climate change, with warming and many other changes. The shift, not only even the fish also shift in the oceans. So we need to link forests and grasslands so that we can facilitate the spread. If there are villages and towns and roads, how will species migrate? So we need to find corridors to link the forests and grasslands and so on. And of course, fire management is one of the biggest challenges facing whole world forestry sector. And we need to protect forests and grasslands with invasive species. Weeds grow everywhere. Once weeds come, natural biodiversity is lost, and all the ecosystem services and functions. Again, there's a need for monitoring of impact of climate change on natural ecosystem. Very little information is available, at least in the tropical countries. A lot of research available in Europe and North America, but not so much in the tropics. And we need, of course, many policies to protect forests, ban or avoid deforestation, forest degradation, forest fragmentation, because that's the most important factor that will contribute to vulnerability of forests and grasslands and wetlands. And we need to manage forests better, especially the fire management in India, even in Europe and North America. They're struggling. I'm sure we'll also struggle if there are forest fires. We need to promote social forestry, community forestry, farm forestry, and industrial forestry to reduce pressure on forests. In India, we have only about 20% of area under forest. We need to protect it. Globally, deforestation continues at 5 to 7 million hectares annually. And of course, there is a need for good understanding of impact of climate change and models. We don't have good vegetation models. We are using some global models, but they're not good enough for tropical forests. And lastly, this is my last slide. There are many global efforts. I will only list few. Of course, Paris Agreement talks about increasing the ability in Article 2, it talks about increasing the ability to adapt to adverse impacts of climate change. A lot of research, Paris Agreement, 50% agreement is about adaptation. How to enable ecosystems and communities to cope with the climate change impacts. And of course, implementation of Paris Agreement is going to be discussed in Glasgow in 2 months' time. And other issues, sustainable development goals. If we really seriously implement or try to achieve the SDGs, SDG 13 on climate action, SDG 14 on life below water, SDG 15 on life on land, I think there's a close link between achieving SDGs and addressing climate change. Unfortunately, we are lagging on both aspects. And biodiversity conservation, there are targets under biodiversity also, just like we have climate change targets. Some are being achieved, some have not yet. Again, Ramsar conservation for wetlands. Wetlands are one of the most vulnerable threatened ecosystems. Wetlands are disappearing, natural wetlands are disappearing. Of course, man-made wetlands are appearing. Of course, land degradation and desertification also is impacting agriculture, forests, and so on. So I think with this, I'll conclude by saying that all ecosystems are already vulnerable to climate change risks, And we are seeing the impacts already, the floods, the forest fires, the heat waves around the world, and we need to take action soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ravindranath, for finishing well within time and touching upon the other important topic of ecology and forest. With this, we have finished our 4 spotlight presentations.